The Chicago Public Library's fluorescent lights hummed overhead like mechanical insects, casting harsh shadows across the returns desk, where I'd spent the last 4 hours organizing new acquisitions. Outside the tall windows, October's early darkness pressed against the glass while autumn winds rattled the old building's bones. At 24, I'd grown accustomed to these late evenings, finding solace in the silence of empty halls, where books waited patiently for tomorrow's readers. My name is Sophia Winters, and books have been my sanctuary since childhood. When my father abandoned us when I was 12, leaving behind nothing but unpaid bills and broken promises, I discovered that fictional worlds offered more stability than reality ever could. When my mother died of cancer 2 years ago, drowning our small family in medical debt despite insurance coverage, I learned that stories could provide comfort when human relationships proved fragile and finite. The library closed at 9, but Tuesdale had given me keys to finish the new inventory. The overtime pay would help with this month's rent on my studio apartment, though it meant walking home alone through neighborhoods that grew less safe after dark. Chicago's public transportation system shut down early in my area, another casualty of budget cuts that affected working people more than city planners who made such decisions from comfortable suburban offices. I was sliding the last stack of romance novels onto their designated shelf when my phone buzzed with an incoming call. Emily's name flashed across the screen, and I answered with the casual warmth reserved for best friends who'd supported each other through every crisis since high school. "Hey, Em. What's up?" "Sophia, thank God you answered." Emily's voice carried panic that immediately set my nerves on edge. "I'm at Northwestern Memorial. It's Mom. There was an accident, and they're saying she might not make it through the night." The fluorescent lights seemed to flicker as blood drained from my face. Emily's mother had been like a second parent to me, especially after Dad left and during Mom's final months. She'd driven me to doctor appointments, helped with college applications, celebrated every small victory when my own family structure was crumbling. "What happened? How bad is it?" "Car accident on the Eisenhower. Some drunk driver ran a red light and hit her passenger side." Emily's words came in rushed bursts between tears. "They had to use the jaws of life to get her out. And there's internal bleeding, possible brain trauma. Sophia, I can't do this alone. Can you come?" I was already gathering my purse and jacket, keys jingling as I mentally calculated travel time across the city. "Of course. I'll catch the next bus and be there as soon as possible. The buses stop running to this area after 10, Emily reminded me through her tears, and I used all my money for the cab to get here. She was right. The number 47 bus that connected my neighborhood to the hospital district ended service at 10:15, and it was already 9:40. A taxi would cost $60 I didn't have, and rideshare prices surged after 10. But Emily needed me, and some obligations transcended financial limitations. "Don't worry about it. I'll figure something out and be there within an hour," I promised, ending the call before she could protest. I locked the library's main entrance behind me, double-checking the security system as Tuesdale had taught me. The street outside was nearly empty, just a few late commuters hurrying toward the elevated train station 3 blocks away. The October air carried the scent of dying leaves and urban decay, while overhead streetlights created pools of amber illumination separated by threatening shadows. My apartment was in the opposite direction from the hospital, making it impossible to retrieve money for transportation. I started walking toward downtown, hoping to catch a bus or find some other solution before Emily's mother's condition worsened. Each step took me further from familiar territory, into areas where young women alone after dark became statistics rather than people. The sidewalks grew quieter as I moved away from the library district. Storefronts were shuttered behind security grates, and the few pedestrians I encountered averted their eyes in the universal urban gesture of avoiding unwanted interaction. My anxiety, always present but usually manageable, began its familiar climb from background nervousness toward something more consuming. I was 3 blocks from the nearest bus stop when I noticed them. 2 men, walking roughly the same pace as me but maintaining distance. When I slowed, they slowed. When I crossed the street, they followed. My mother had taught me to trust instincts about personal safety, and every alarm bell in my consciousness was now screaming warnings I couldn't ignore. My phone buzzed with another call from Emily. I answered while walking faster, hoping my pursuers were coincidental rather than intentional. "Sophia, where are you? Mom's getting worse, and the doctors want to discuss treatment options with family. I'm walking to the bus stop, but I think someone's following me." My voice dropped to a whisper as I glanced over my shoulder. The two men had closed the distance, and something metallic glinted in one of their hands. "What?" "Sophia, get somewhere safe. Forget about coming here if you're in danger." But I couldn't forget. Emily's mother was dying, and I was the closest thing to family Emily had left. My own abandonment issues wouldn't let me become another person who failed to show up when needed most. The irony wasn't lost on me that my determination to be reliable might get me killed before I could help anyone. The men behind me quickened their pace. I could hear their footsteps now, heavy boots against wet pavement. The familiar tightness began in my chest, that precursor to panic attacks that had plagued me since Mother's death. Breathing became conscious effort rather than automatic function. The world started to narrow, peripheral vision fading as my nervous system prepared for fight or flight, but there was nowhere to run, and no one to fight for me. I fumbled for my keys, holding them between my fingers as a makeshift weapon, while simultaneously trying to dial emergency services. The phone slipped from my suddenly sweaty palm, clattering onto the concrete as my pursuers broke into a run. That's when everything collapsed. My chest constricted like a fist closing around my lungs. The streetlights blurred into streaks of amber and white. My legs gave out, and I fell to my knees on the wet sidewalk, gasping for air that felt thick as water. Panic attack in full bloom, rendering me helpless while danger approached. I heard car doors slam, angry voices, then sudden silence. When consciousness flickered back, I was being lifted by strong arms, carried toward a vehicle idling at the curb. Through the haze of residual panic, I caught a glimpse of my rescuer. Dark hair, expensive suit, eyes like winter storm clouds. "Where am I?" I managed to whisper, as he placed me carefully in the passenger seat of what appeared to be a luxury sedan. His voice was deep, controlled, carrying authority that seemed to reshape the very air around us. "Safe, for now. Don't fight me. You nearly died out there." The car pulled away from the curb, leaving behind the two men who'd been following me. Through the rear window, I watched them standing beneath a streetlight, looking confused and oddly defeated. Whatever had just happened, it involved more than a simple rescue from random street crime. As we drove through Chicago's late-night streets, I studied my mysterious savior in the dashboard's glow. He was handsome in the way that suggested both refinement and danger, with sharp cheekbones and a jaw that looked carved from granite. His hands on the steering wheel bore expensive rings, and everything about his presence suggested someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Thank you," I said, though the words felt inadequate for whatever had just transpired. He glanced at me, those storm-gray eyes assessing in ways that made me feel exposed despite being fully clothed. "Thank me when you understand what you're truly safe from." I awakened to sunlight streaming through windows that belonged in an architectural magazine rather than the cramped studio apartment I called home. The bed beneath me felt like floating on clouds, Egyptian cotton sheets that probably cost more than my monthly rent, supporting a mattress that conformed to every curve of my body with luxurious precision. For a disorienting moment, I wondered if I was still dreaming, caught between the panic attack that had claimed my consciousness and whatever strange reality I'd awakened into. The bedroom surrounding me spoke of wealth that existed in different stratospheres than my own experience. Hardwood floors gleamed with the patina of careful maintenance, while original artwork adorned walls painted in colors that suggested professional interior design. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see Lake Michigan stretching toward the horizon, which meant this residence sat in one of Chicago's most exclusive neighborhoods. Memory returned in fragments, collapsing on the sidewalk, strong arms lifting me, a voice promising safety. My rescuer from the previous night remained a mystery wrapped in expensive suits and storm-gray eyes. Where was I? And more importantly, why had a stranger brought me to what appeared to be his home rather than a hospital? The door opened with silent efficiency, admitting a man in his 50s wearing scrubs that marked him as medical personnel. Behind him walked my mysterious rescuer, looking even more imposing in daylight than he had in the sedan's amber glow. Sleep had done nothing to diminish his presence. If anything, the combination of tailored clothing and natural authority made him seem larger, more dangerous, completely at ease in surroundings that left me feeling displaced and vulnerable. "Miss Winters," the medical professional said, checking readings on a tablet while approaching the bed. "I'm Dr. Reeves. How are you feeling this morning?" The casual use of my surname sent chills down my spine. I hadn't given my name to anyone, yet these strangers possessed information about my identity that suggested investigation rather than coincidence. "How do you know who I am?" My rescuer stepped forward, dismissing the doctor with a subtle gesture that spoke of someone accustomed to commanding obedience without effort. When we were alone, he studied me with the same intensity I remembered from our brief car conversation, as if cataloging details for purposes I couldn't fathom. "Information is easy to acquire when you have the right resources," he said, settling into a chair that positioned him close enough to seem intimate but far enough to avoid appearing threatening. "Sophia Winters, 24 years old, librarian at Chicago Public Library's main branch. Lives alone in a studio apartment on North Clark. Orphaned mother died 2 years ago from cancer. Father absent since age 12. Each detail felt like a violation, confirmation that my privacy had been systematically dismantled by someone with capabilities far beyond normal citizen reach. "What gives you the right to investigate me without permission? The same right that saved your life last night." His response carried no apology, only the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who viewed privacy as a luxury he couldn't afford to grant. "Those men following you weren't random predators looking for an easy target." Fear crawled up my throat as implications sank in. I'd assumed my near assault was opportunistic crime, the kind of random violence that plagued urban areas after dark. The suggestion of something more deliberate transformed last night from bad luck into targeted threat. "What do you mean?" Instead of answering immediately, he reached into his suit jacket and withdrew a phone, scrolling through what appeared to be surveillance footage. The screen showed grainy images of 2 men watching the library entrance, then following me as I walked toward downtown. Their behavior suggested patience and planning, rather than spontaneous criminal activity. "Professional surveillance, not street criminals hunting for purses and jewelry," he explained, handing me the phone so I could see the evidence. "Someone wanted you followed, possibly taken. The panic attack that incapacitated you prevented us from learning their ultimate objective." My hands trembled as I studied the footage, recognizing my own figure moving through familiar streets while being stalked by individuals whose faces remained partially obscured. The violation felt complete. Not only had I been hunted, but my rescue had been recorded by yet another party with resources to monitor Chicago's streets. "Who are you?" I asked, though part of me feared the answer might be more disturbing than remaining ignorant. "Dante Romano." He delivered his name like a business card, expecting recognition I didn't possess. "You collapsed outside one of my buildings while fleeing from men who intended you harm." Romano. The surname carried weight in Chicago, associated with business interests that newspapers discussed in careful euphemisms. Not quite criminal, but not entirely legitimate either. The kind of family that appeared in society pages while federal investigators maintained discrete files on their activities. I was in the home of someone whose world operated by different rules than the ones that governed library science and studio apartment living. "What happens now?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded, despite the fear coursing through my system. "Now you recover fully, and we determine why someone wanted you surveilled." Dante's tone suggested these weren't requests, but statements of fact. Chicago streets aren't safe for women alone at night under normal circumstances. For someone with a target on her back, they're lethal. The casual mention of targets made my chest tighten with familiar anxiety patterns. "I need to get to Northwestern Memorial. My friend's mother was in an accident and she's waiting for me. Your friend Emily Morrison. Her mother survived surgery and is stable." Dante's knowledge of my personal crisis shouldn't have surprised me anymore, but it still felt like having my thoughts read by someone with no right to access them. "Hospital bills have been handled by an anonymous benefactor, and Emily has been informed that you're safe, but unable to visit immediately." The efficient management of my life without consultation was simultaneously helpful and terrifying. Someone with Dante's resources could solve problems I couldn't even afford to address, but the cost of such assistance remained undefined and potentially more expensive than financial debt. "Why are you helping me?" "Because leaving someone to die on my territory reflects poorly on my ability to maintain order." His honesty was brutal, but refreshing after a lifetime of people who sugar-coated their motivations. And because whoever wanted you followed will try again if they believe their first attempt failed due to coincidence rather than intervention. He stood with fluid grace, moving to the window where morning light illuminated the sharp planes of his face and emphasized the controlled power in his posture. From this angle, I could see a small scar bisecting his left eyebrow and the careful way he positioned himself to maintain visual contact with both me and the door. This was someone who'd learned not to trust his back to anyone, even in his own home. This is your choice, Miss Winters. You can return to your apartment, your job, your normal routine, and hope that last night was an isolated incident. Or you can accept my protection until we identify the threat and eliminate it permanently. The word eliminate hung in the air between us, heavy with implications that belonged in crime novels, rather than conversations with librarians. I was being offered safety by someone whose methods for providing it might involve consequences I preferred not to contemplate. What does your protection entail, exactly? Dante's smile was sharp as winter wind off Lake Michigan. It means you don't walk Chicago streets alone after dark. It means your apartment receives security upgrades you didn't request but desperately need. It means anyone who considers you a target will have to go through me first. The offer was seductive and terrifying in equal measure. Accept help from Dante Romano, and I might survive whatever threat had materialized around me. But accepting help from men like Dante Romano meant entering a world where problems were solved through methods that didn't require courts or legal proceedings. Those men following you weren't random criminals, he continued, watching my face for reactions I tried to hide. Someone with resources hired professionals to track your movements. That level of organization suggests you're connected to something valuable, whether you realize it or not. My mind raced through possibilities, trying to identify anything in my quiet librarian existence that might attract dangerous attention. I had no money worth stealing, no secrets worth protecting, no enemies worth targeting. The most exciting thing about my life was my ongoing battle with overdue book fines, and whether I could afford both rent and groceries in the same month. I don't understand what anyone could want from me. Neither do I, yet. Dante's expression suggested this mystery intrigued, rather than frustrated him. But in 3 hours, I know more about your background than you've shared with people you consider friends. Information is my business, Miss Winters, and you've become very interesting business indeed. The investigation of my life was continuing even as we spoke, I realized. Somewhere in this mansion, people were examining my history, my relationships, my financial records, searching for connections that might explain why someone had marked me for surveillance. The thought of such scrutiny made my skin crawl, but the alternative, remaining ignorant while danger circled closer, seemed infinitely worse. What did you find? I asked, though I wasn't certain I wanted to know the answer. Dante returned to his chair, leaning forward slightly in a gesture that made our conversation feel intimate, despite its frightening subject matter. Your mother's cancer treatment was partially funded by an anonymous benefactor during her final months. Someone wanted to ensure she received care that insurance wouldn't cover. The revelation struck like a physical blow. Mother's experimental treatments had been expensive, far beyond our family's means, but somehow the bills had been manageable. We'd assumed insurance had covered more than expected, or that payment plans had been more generous than typical. Learning that someone had been secretly helping us felt like discovering our struggles had been observed and judged worthy of intervention. Who? I whispered, though something in Dante's expression suggested I already knew. Someone who believes in taking care of people when they can't take care of themselves. His words carried weight that went beyond simple charity. Someone who doesn't like watching good people suffer for circumstances beyond their control. I insisted on returning to my apartment despite Dante's obvious disapproval, clinging to the illusion that normal life might still be possible if I simply refused to acknowledge the danger surrounding me. He didn't argue, which should have been reassuring, but instead felt ominous, like a chess master allowing his opponent to make a predictable mistake. I can't stay hidden in your house forever, I said, as his driver prepared to take me home. I have a job, responsibilities, a life that doesn't involve bodyguards and surveillance footage. No, Dante agreed, watching me with those storm-gray eyes that seemed to catalog every micro-expression I made. You have the illusion of a normal life, but illusions don't stop bullets or prevent kidnappings. The ride back to my studio apartment felt like traveling between dimensions. From the leather interior of Dante's luxury sedan, the familiar streets of my neighborhood looked shabbier, more dangerous than I'd ever noticed. Building facades that had seemed quaint now appeared neglected, and shadows that had never bothered me felt pregnant with potential threats. My apartment building's security door had been repaired sometime during my absence. The lock that had been broken for 6 months now worked perfectly, requiring my key rather than simply pulling open to admit anyone from the street. In my mailbox, I found notice that the building's security system had been upgraded and would be fully operational within 48 hours. Inside my studio, everything appeared exactly as I'd left it, but somehow the space felt different. Safer, maybe, or perhaps more surveilled. I couldn't tell which, and that uncertainty made my skin crawl with anxiety that had nothing to do with my usual panic triggers. Emily called within an hour of my return, her voice bright with relief and gratitude. "Sophia, I don't know how to thank you for arranging Mom's medical bills. The hospital administrator said an anonymous benefactor covered everything, including the surgery and rehabilitation costs. I didn't arrange anything," I said truthfully, though I suspected who had. "How is she doing?" "Better than anyone expected. The doctors are saying full recovery is possible with proper physical therapy." Emily's voice caught with emotion. "I know you must have used all your savings or taken out loans. I'll find a way to pay you back, I promise." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Emily describing her mother's progress and expressing gratitude for help I couldn't claim credit for providing. When I finally ended the call, guilt settled in my chest like a stone. Someone else, Dante, had solved Emily's crisis while I'd been unconscious in his guest bedroom. Yet she believed I was responsible for her family's salvation. 3 days passed in a strange, suspended animation. I returned to work at the library, cataloging new acquisitions and helping patrons find books that might transport them from their own problems into more manageable fictional ones. No one followed me during daylight hours. No threatening messages appeared in my mailbox, and no mysterious men lurked near bus stops as I traveled between home and work. But I felt watched constantly, an invisible weight of observation that made every public moment feel performed. Was Dante's protection the source of this sensation? Or was someone else maintaining surveillance that had simply become more subtle? Without training in such matters, I couldn't distinguish between safety and continued threat. On Thursday evening, as I was closing the library's circulation desk, Dante appeared between the stacks like a figure materialized from expensive shadows. He moved through the library's academic atmosphere with the same controlled grace he'd displayed in his mansion. But here, surrounded by books and scholarly quiet, he seemed even more out of place, and therefore more dangerous. "Miss Winters," he said, approaching my desk with silent footsteps that suggested either natural stealth or professional training. "I hope you don't mind the unannounced visit. This is a public library," I managed, acutely aware that we were alone in the building. Tuesdale had left an hour earlier, trusting me to handle closing procedures independently. "Anyone can walk in during business hours." "Not anyone," Dante corrected, settling into a chair across from my desk with casual authority. "Security footage shows no unauthorized visitors in the past 72 hours. Your building's new system has been very effective at discouraging unwanted attention." The revelation that he'd been monitoring the library's security feeds shouldn't have surprised me, but it still felt like discovering that privacy was a concept he didn't recognize. "You've been watching me work? I've been ensuring your safety while you insisted on maintaining normal routines." His tone suggested this distinction was important, though I couldn't see the meaningful difference between protection and surveillance when both involved cameras tracking my every movement. "And what have you concluded from your observation?" Dante leaned back in the chair, studying me with the same intensity that had characterized our every interaction. "That you genuinely believe you can return to your previous life by pretending the threat doesn't exist. It's admirable and completely naive." Heat rose in my cheeks at the casual dismissal of my attempts at normalcy. Not everyone solves problems by hiding in mansions surrounded by armed guards. "No," he agreed. Most people who refuse adequate protection end up dead or wishing they were. But you're not most people, are you, Miss Winters? Before I could ask what he meant, Dante stood and moved toward the library's rare books section, running his fingers along leather spines with surprising reverence. Among the scholarly atmosphere and towering shelves, his dangerous edge seemed temporarily softened, replaced by something that might have been genuine appreciation for learning. "I'd like to show you something," he said, turning back toward me. "Away from here, somewhere we can speak privately without concern for electronic surveillance or unexpected visitors." Every rational instinct screamed warnings about accepting further invitations from men like Dante Romano. But curiosity had always been my weakness, the drive that led me to library science and made me effective at research. The mystery of his interest in me, combined with growing awareness of threats I couldn't identify or counter alone, overrode caution. "Where?" I asked, already reaching for my purse and jacket. "Dinner, somewhere that closes for private parties when I make reservations." His smile held promises I couldn't interpret, equal parts seductive and threatening. "Trust me to feed you properly and show you something beautiful." The restaurant was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Located in a renovated warehouse in River North, it appeared closed from the street, with no signs or visible activity. But when Dante's driver pulled to the curb, the door opened immediately, revealing an interior that belonged in European capitals rather than industrial Chicago. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across tables set with china that probably cost more per place setting than I made in a month. A single table had been prepared in an alcove overlooking the Chicago River, positioned to provide both intimacy and visual security. The waitstaff moved with choreographed precision, appearing when needed and vanishing when conversation required privacy. "You own this place," I said, not really asking. "I own several restaurants throughout the city," Dante confirmed, pouring wine that tasted like liquid luxury into glasses that caught light like captured starlight. "This one caters to clients who value discretion above publicity." The meal was art disguised as food, each course carefully composed and perfectly seasoned, accompanied by wines that enhanced flavors I didn't know existed. Throughout dinner, Dante spoke about Chicago's history, the development of neighborhoods I'd lived in but never truly understood, the economic forces that shaped urban life for people like me. "You know a lot about the city for someone who probably doesn't ride public transportation," I observed, surprised by how natural conversation felt despite the extraordinary circumstances. "I know Chicago because it's my responsibility to understand every aspect of my territory," he replied, the word territory carrying implications that went far beyond normal business concerns. From the political structures that determine zoning laws to the individual families struggling to maintain dignity while surrounded by economic forces beyond their control. "Families like mine was," I said quietly. Something shifted in Dante's expression, a softening that made him seem more human, and therefore more dangerous to my emotional equilibrium. "Your mother fought harder than most people could manage. Cancer is a battle that requires resources many families don't possess, no matter how much love they have to give. How do you know so much about her illness?" "Because I made sure she received every possible treatment option." His honesty was gentle, but absolute. When someone dies too young from a disease that money can treat, it reflects poorly on the community that failed to help them. The casual admission that he'd been secretly helping my family for years rewrote everything I thought I knew about my own life. Mother's final months had been painful, but not financially devastating, though we'd assumed her insurance had been more comprehensive than expected. Learning that a stranger had been quietly ensuring her care felt like discovering that my most private struggles had been observed and managed by someone I'd never met. "Why?" I whispered, the question barely audible over the restaurant's soft instrumental music. "Because some things matter more than profit margins or business efficiency." Dante's fingers traced patterns on the white tablecloth, his attention seemingly focused on the abstract design he was creating. "Because watching good people suffer when help is available violates every principle I was raised to respect." When he looked up, his eyes held vulnerability I hadn't seen before, as if admitting to charity was somehow more revealing than confessing to criminal activity. In that moment, I glimpsed the person beneath the dangerous exterior, someone who used power to protect, rather than simply to accumulate more power. "You're not what I expected," I said, surprising myself with the admission. What did you expect? Someone colder, more calculating. Less. I struggled for the right word, then settled on honesty. Less human. Dante's laugh held genuine amusement, rather than the sharp edge that characterized most of his expressions. Humanity is a luxury men in my position rarely afford themselves, but occasionally, someone comes along who makes it seem like a reasonable risk. The weight of his gaze made me feel exposed in ways that had nothing to do with physical vulnerability. We were approaching territory that felt more dangerous than the original threat that had brought us together. Emotional, rather than physical peril that could reshape my understanding of safety and desire. We should go, I said, though every instinct argued against leaving this beautiful space where danger felt distant and intimacy seemed possible. Yes, Dante agreed, but neither of us moved immediately. We should. The drive back to my apartment passed in comfortable silence, the city lights creating a kaleidoscope of color against the sedan's windows. When we arrived at my building, Dante walked me to the entrance, his presence making the familiar streets feel safer than they had since the night I'd collapsed. Thank you for dinner, I said, keys in hand but reluctant to end an evening that had transformed my understanding of the man who'd appointed himself my protector. Thank you for trusting me enough to accept the invitation. He stepped closer, not threateningly, but enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and masculine that made my pulse quicken. Sophia. The use of my first name rather than formal address sent warmth through my chest. Before I could analyze the sensation or consider its implications, his fingers brushed against my cheek, tracing the line of my jaw with exquisite gentleness. Sleep well, he said, stepping back before the moment could develop into something more complicated. Tomorrow we begin identifying exactly who wants you under surveillance and why. As I watched his sedan disappear into Chicago's late-night traffic, I realized that accepting Dante Romano's protection had changed more than just my security status. It had awakened possibilities I'd never allowed myself to imagine. Dangerous attractions that threatened to be more consuming than any external threat I might face. The flowers arrived on Friday morning, delivered to the library's main desk while I was helping a graduate student locate obscure poetry collections. A massive arrangement of black roses and white lilies, beautiful in a way that suggested both elegance and menace. The delivery man waited while I signed for them, his professional demeanor masking obvious discomfort with whatever message he'd been hired to convey. Inside the arrangement, nestled among the expensive blooms, was a card written in elegant script. Beautiful things deserve beautiful endings. Some stories conclude whether the reader is ready or not. My hands trembled as I read the message twice, then a third time, hoping the words would somehow rearrange themselves into something less threatening. But the meaning remained crystal clear. Someone was watching me. Someone who viewed my existence as a narrative they had the power to conclude. Tuesdale emerged from the reference section, took one look at the flowers and my pale face, and immediately reached for the phone. I'm calling security, he said, though we both knew the library's elderly security guard was better equipped to handle noisy teenagers than genuine threats. Don't, I said quickly, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. I need to handle this through other channels. I called Dante from the staff room, my fingers shaking as I dialed the number he'd given me for emergencies. He answered on the first ring, as if he'd been expecting this exact conversation. What happened? No greeting, no pleasantries, just immediate focus on potential danger. Flowers, with a message. I read him the card's contents, hearing my own voice grow steadier as I spoke. Something about Dante's controlled attention helped center my spinning thoughts. Don't touch them again. Don't throw them away. I'm sending Marco to collect everything for analysis. The background noise on his end suggested movement, preparations being made with the efficiency of someone accustomed to crisis management. Are you safe where you are right now? I looked around the library's familiar interior, suddenly seeing it through different eyes. Wide windows that offered clear sightlines for anyone watching from the street. Multiple entrances that would be impossible to monitor simultaneously. Stacks of books that could conceal someone moving between floors. I don't know anymore. Stay exactly where you are. Marco will be there in 15 minutes, and he's bringing backup. Dante's voice carried the same controlled authority I'd grown to associate with safety. But underneath it, I detected something new, anger that felt personal rather than professional. Whoever sent those flowers made a mistake by escalating to direct contact. Marco arrived with 2 other men, all wearing suits that couldn't quite hide the fact that they were armed and extremely alert. They moved through the library with practiced efficiency, collecting the flowers and photographing everything while maintaining casual conversation with Tuesdale about library security and neighborhood safety. "Miss Winters," Marco said quietly, approaching my desk while his companions completed their work. "Mr. Romano wants you to understand that this changes the situation significantly." "How?" "Direct threats mean whoever's been watching you has decided surveillance isn't sufficient anymore." Marco's tone was matter of fact, but his eyes constantly scanned the library's interior for potential threats. "They're moving toward active engagement." The phrase active engagement sent cold fear through my system, but I forced myself to ask the question that mattered most. "What does that mean for my safety?" "It means your normal routine just became impossible to maintain." Marco's honesty was brutal, but necessary. Library work, walking alone, living in an unsecured apartment, all of that has to change until we identify and eliminate the threat. I wanted to argue, to insist on maintaining the independence I'd fought so hard to achieve after my parents' deaths. But the flowers sitting on my desk represented a level of malice that my library science degree and modest self-defense knowledge couldn't counter. Someone with resources and connections was playing games with my life, and I was hopelessly outmatched. "Where does Dante want me to go?" "He's having your apartment secured as we speak," Marco replied. "New locks, surveillance system, reinforced door frame. You can maintain some normalcy, but not without constant protection." When I returned home that evening, the changes were immediately obvious. The building's entrance now required a keycard rather than just a working lock, and security cameras had been installed at every entry point. Inside my studio apartment, motion sensors and window alarms created an invisible network of electronic protection that would alert Dante's people to any unauthorized access. The transformation of my modest living space into a high-security fortress should have felt reassuring, but instead, it emphasized how completely my life had spiraled beyond my control. I was living in a cage made of safety measures, protected, but no longer free to move through the world without considering threats I couldn't see or understand. Saturday brought no respite from the growing tension. Marco positioned himself discreetly near the library during my shift, while other members of Dante's security team maintained surveillance from vehicles parked strategically around the building. Their presence was subtle enough to avoid alarming other library patrons, but obvious enough to make me hyper-aware of being watched and protected simultaneously. During my lunch break, I discovered Dante waiting in the rare books section, reading what appeared to be a collection of Italian poetry. Surrounded by centuries-old literature and scholarly quiet, he seemed more accessible than usual. Dangerous edge softened by genuine appreciation for learning and culture. "Finding anything interesting?" I asked, settling into the chair across from his reading nook. "Dante Alighieri," he replied, closing the book but keeping his finger between the pages to mark his place. "My namesake, though I doubt my parents expected me to understand the irony when they chose the name." "The irony?" "A man who wrote about journeys through hell while creating his own version of paradise." Dante's smile held self-awareness that was both attractive and unsettling. Sometimes I wonder if he'd recognize the world his descendants created. The literary conversation felt surreal given the circumstances that had brought us together. But it also revealed depths to Dante's character that purely business relationships wouldn't have exposed. Here was someone who found meaning in poetry and philosophy, while managing enterprises that operated outside legal boundaries. "You're not what I expected when I first heard the name Romano," I admitted. "What did you expect?" "Someone less educated, more obviously criminal." I hesitated, then decided on complete honesty. Someone who wouldn't care about anonymous medical bills or flowers with threatening messages. Dante set the book aside and leaned forward, bringing his attention into sharp focus on my face. "The flowers aren't random harassment, Sophia. They represent escalation from professional surveillance to personal intimidation." "What's the difference?" "Professional surveillance suggests someone wants information about your activities, your connections, your potential value as leverage against someone else." His explanation was clinical. but I caught the tension in his voice that suggested personal investment in my safety. Personal intimidation means they've moved beyond information gathering toward direct action. Action like what? Kidnapping, torture, murder disguised as accident or random crime. Dante's brutal honesty cut through any remaining illusions I might have held about my situation. The flowers were a warning that your time for normal life has expired. Fear crystallized in my chest, not the familiar anxiety of my panic attacks, but something colder and more focused. Who would want to hurt me? I don't have money, political connections, access to valuable information. I'm nobody important. You're important to me, Dante said quietly, the admission carrying more weight than any elaborate declaration could have managed. And in my world, that makes you a target for people who want to hurt me but can't reach me directly. The simple statement restructured everything I thought I understood about my situation. I wasn't being threatened because of something I'd done or witnessed, but because of something I'd become. Important to a man whose enemies would use any available weapon against him. I never asked to be important to you, I whispered. Neither did I, Dante replied. But some things happen regardless of what we plan or want, or think we can control. Before I could respond to this admission, Marco appeared between the stacks with the same silent efficiency that characterized all of Dante's people. His expression was grim in ways that suggested the afternoon's developments hadn't been encouraging. "We need to go," Marco said without preamble. "Now." Dante was on his feet instantly, all trace of literary contemplation replaced by focused alertness. "What happened?" "Costa family made contact. They want to discuss terms for your girlfriend's safety." Marco's words sent ice through my veins, confirming fears I'd been trying to suppress since the flowers arrived. "I'm not his girlfriend," I protested, though the distinction felt meaningless when facing people who viewed relationships as opportunities for leverage. "Doesn't matter what you are," Marco replied. "Matters what they think you are, and what they believe Dante will sacrifice to protect you." The Costa family. I'd heard the name mentioned in newspapers, usually in articles about federal investigations and suspicious business practices. They operated in the same shadowy world as Dante, but apparently as competitors rather than allies. "What kind of terms?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would terrify me. "The kind that assume you're negotiable," Dante said, his voice carrying controlled fury that made him seem more dangerous than I'd ever seen him. They're about to learn how wrong that assumption is. As we prepared to leave the library under Marco's protective escort, I realized that my quiet life of books and modest independence had become a casualty of forces beyond my comprehension. But looking at Dante's face as he processed the Costa family's threat, I also understood that someone was prepared to wage war to protect me from consequences I'd never chosen, but could no longer escape. The ride to Dante's mansion passed in tense silence, broken only by periodic phone calls that he answered in rapid Italian, while Marco drove with the focused intensity of someone expecting potential attack at any moment. Through the sedan's bulletproof windows, Chicago's familiar streets looked different. Not like home territory, but like a battlefield where enemies could emerge from any shadow. "What happens now?" I asked, as we pulled through the security gates that protected Dante's Lincoln Park estate. "Now we find out exactly what the Costa family thinks you're worth," Dante replied, "and we show them what I'm willing to do to keep you safe." The promise in his voice should have been reassuring, but instead it felt like standing at the edge of an abyss, knowing that stepping forward would change everything about the person I'd thought I was, and the life I'd believed I wanted. But as another wave of panic tried to claim my composure, I realized something had shifted in my response to danger. Instead of collapsing into helplessness, I felt a strange clarity settle over my thoughts. If being important to Dante Romano made me a target, then perhaps it was time to discover what that importance might make me capable of becoming. Emily arrived at Dante's mansion unannounced on Sunday evening, her appearance so unexpected that security initially refused her entrance until I intervened personally. She looked terrible, hollow-eyed, pale, wearing clothes that suggested she'd been sleeping in them for days. When she finally sat across from me in Dante's formal living room, her hands trembled as she reached for the tea his staff had prepared. "I need to tell you something," she said without preamble, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd been rehearsing difficult words. Something I should have said years ago, but I was too scared, too ashamed, too desperate to find another way. Dread settled in my stomach like cold stone. Emily had been my closest friend since high school, the only person who'd known about my panic attacks, who'd helped me through Mother's illness, who'd celebrated every small victory in my carefully reconstructed life. If she was here, looking like guilt personified, then the foundation of trust I'd built my adult relationships on was about to crumble. "What is it, Em?" "My family owes money. A lot of money. More than we could ever pay back even if we sold everything and worked for the rest of our lives." She stared into her teacup, as if reading terrible fortunes in the leaves. "It started with Dad's gambling. Then Mom's accident made everything worse. And when the medical bills came, we had nowhere else to turn." "Turn to who?" I asked, though something in the back of my mind was already connecting pieces I didn't want to see assembled. "The Costa family." Emily's confession came out as barely more than a whisper. "They loan money when banks won't. But their interest rates and collection methods are different." Ice flooded my veins as I processed the implications. The Costa family, the same organization that had been threatening me, that had sent flowers with messages about beautiful endings. Emily's family crisis and my current danger weren't separate problems, but connected threads in a web I was only beginning to understand. "How long?" My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, hollow with the growing recognition of betrayal. 3 years. Since right after your mother died and you were dealing with all the funeral expenses and debt." Emily's hands shook more violently as she continued. "They said they could help, that families should support each other during difficult times. But what they really wanted was leverage over people who couldn't fight back." "What kind of leverage?" Emily's face crumpled with shame that looked genuine, though I no longer trusted my ability to distinguish between authentic emotion and carefully performed manipulation. "Information. About your routines, your work schedule, your relationships. They said it was harmless, just wanting to know that you were safe and stable. The systematic violation felt worse than physical assault. For 3 years, my most private moments had been reported to people who viewed my life as potential ammunition against someone else. Every conversation with Emily had been filtered through calculations about what information might be valuable to the Costa family's interests. "You've been spying on me for 3 years?" The question emerged with surprising calm, though fury was building beneath the surface like pressure in a sealed container. "Not spying. Just staying close. Being a good friend who happened to mention things in casual conversation." Emily's distinction felt pathetic even as she offered it. "They never asked me to hurt you or put you in danger. They just wanted to know about your daily life. Until recently." Emily's silence confirmed what I'd already suspected. The escalation from passive surveillance to active threats meant her handlers had moved beyond information gathering toward more direct action. "What changed?" I pressed. "What made them decide observation wasn't sufficient anymore?" "Dante Romano." Emily's voice broke completely as she spoke his name. "When they realized you were connected to him, everything became more urgent. They said you were in a position to provide valuable intelligence about his operations, his security procedures, his personal vulnerabilities. So they asked you to get closer to me, to dig deeper." "They didn't ask." Emily's correction was fierce but desperate. "They threatened. Mom's medical treatment, our house, my little brother's college fund. Everything we care about hangs on our cooperation with their requests." I stood abruptly, pacing to the window that offered views of Lake Michigan while I processed the magnitude of Emily's betrayal. My best friend, the person I'd trusted with my deepest fears and most private struggles, had been reporting my activities to criminals who wanted to use that information against someone I was growing to care about. "The flowers," I said, turning back toward Emily. "Did you tell them about my panic attacks? About how specific triggers can incapacitate me?" Emily's guilty expression confirmed my suspicions. "They asked about your emotional responses to stress, whether certain situations might make you more cooperative or easier to manage." The clinical way she described my psychological vulnerabilities made me feel like a laboratory specimen being studied for weaknesses. Every panic attack I'd confided in her, every moment of vulnerability I'd shared during Mother's illness, had been cataloged and reported to people who viewed my mental health as tactical intelligence. "Where's the wire?" I asked suddenly, the question occurring to me with crystalline clarity. "What?" "The recording device. The way you're positioned, The careful word choices. The fact that you came here alone despite knowing this place is probably under surveillance. I moved closer to Emily's chair, studying her clothing and posture for signs of hidden electronics. They sent you here to get me on record discussing Dante's activities, didn't they? Emily's face went ash white, confirming my suspicions even before she spoke. Sophia, you don't understand the pressure they apply. They don't just threaten you. They demonstrate what happens to people who refuse their requests. Show me the device. With shaking hands, Emily reached into her purse and withdrew what appeared to be a high-end smartphone, its screen indicating active recording. Everything we'd discussed had been transmitted to people who intended to use my words as evidence of cooperation with criminal enterprises. 3 years, I said, amazement replacing anger as the full scope of the deception became clear. 3 years of friendship, of trust, of believing someone actually cared about my well-being without ulterior motives. I do care about you, Emily protested, tears streaming down her face. Everything we shared was real. The spying was separate, compartmentalized. I never let it affect our actual friendship. You think those can be separate? You think you can report someone's private life to criminals while maintaining genuine emotional connection? My laugh sounded bitter, even to my own ears. You've been performing friendship while conducting surveillance, Em. That's not compartmentalization. That's sociopathy. The harsh assessment struck Emily like a physical blow, but I felt no satisfaction in her pain. The person I'd trusted most in the world had proven as unreliable as every other relationship in my life, confirming fears about human connection that I'd been trying to overcome since childhood. A soft knock interrupted our confrontation. Marco entered with his usual silent efficiency, but his expression carried urgency that suggested developments beyond Emily's confession. Miss Winters, we need to speak privately, he said, glancing at Emily with obvious suspicion. There have been additional complications. What kind of complications? The kind that involve people who aren't supposed to be in this house carrying recording equipment. Marco's tone was matter of fact, but his positioning near the door suggested readiness for potential violence. Mr. Romano wants to see you immediately. As Emily was escorted away by security personnel, I realized that her betrayal was only the beginning of revelations that would reshape my understanding of everyone I'd trusted. If my closest friend had been compromised for years, then how many other relationships in my life were based on deception rather than genuine affection? Dante waited in his private study, standing behind the massive desk that dominated the room like a fortress wall. His expression was darker than I'd ever seen it, controlled fury radiating from every line of his body as he processed information that had clearly exceeded his worst expectations. How much did you tell her? He asked without preamble. Tell her what? About our relationship. About your feelings. About information you might have gathered regarding my business operations. Dante's questions came rapid fire, each one highlighting how completely my privacy had been compromised. How much intelligence did you inadvertently provide to the Costa family through someone you trusted? The realization hit like cold water. Every conversation with Emily about my growing attraction to Dante. Every detail I'd shared about his kindness or his protective behavior, every observation about his home or his associates had been transmitted to people who could use that information as weapons against him. I don't know, I admitted, sinking into a chair as the enormity of my unwitting cooperation became clear. I told her things I thought were private. Personal observations, emotional responses, details about how you made me feel safe. Emotional responses they can use to manipulate your decision-making. Personal observations that reveal security procedures and personal habits. Dante's analysis was clinical, but not cruel. Professional assessment rather than personal accusation. Details about feeling safe that they can exploit by threatening to remove that safety. You knew, I said suddenly, certainty crystallizing as I watched his controlled reaction to information that should have been devastating news. You knew Emily was reporting to the Costa family, and you didn't tell me. Dante's silence confirmed my suspicions. He'd known about the surveillance, about the betrayal, about the systematic violation of my trust, and he'd allowed me to continue confiding in someone who was reporting my every word to his enemies. How long? I asked, voice growing stronger as anger replaced shock. 6 months, since shortly after the night I found you on the street. Dante's honesty was brutal, but complete. We identified the Costa family's intelligence network early in our investigation, including Emily's role as unwitting informant. Unwitting. She genuinely believed she was protecting her family by providing harmless social information. The Costa family deliberately kept her ignorant of how that information would be used. Dante moved around the desk, approaching my chair with cautious steps. But her ignorance doesn't change the fact that you've been compromised for years. And you didn't tell me because? Because we needed to understand the full scope of their intelligence gathering before disrupting it. And because we needed you to behave naturally around Emily so she wouldn't suspect her cover had been blown. Dante's strategic thinking was logical, but felt like another layer of betrayal. Telling you would have compromised our ability to control the information flow. I stood abruptly, backing away from Dante with the same instinctive retreat I'd felt when first discovering Emily's deception. So you used me too. Let me continue trusting someone who was betraying me, because it served your tactical purposes. I used the situation to protect you, Dante corrected. But his distinction felt meaningless when viewed from my perspective as the person who'd been kept ignorant of threats to my own safety. By lying to me. By letting me believe I had a genuine friendship while you knew it was completely fabricated. Hurt was transforming into fury, hot and cleansing after days of confusion and fear. You're no different from Emily. You just have better reasons for your deception. I kept you alive, Dante replied, his voice carrying steel that suggested his patience with my accusations was approaching its limits. Emily's information allowed us to anticipate Costa family moves, to stay ahead of their planning, to ensure they couldn't use their intelligence advantage against you, without my knowledge or consent. Without your knowledge because your safety required ignorance. Without your consent, because you would have made emotional decisions that could have gotten you killed. Dante's brutal honesty cut through my anger like a blade, forcing me to confront the possibility that his deception had been protective rather than manipulative. I can't trust anyone, I said, the admission emerging as barely more than a whisper. Not Emily. Not you. Not anyone in this world you've dragged me into. You can trust me to keep you alive, Dante offered. Everything else is luxury we can discuss when the immediate threats have been eliminated. But survival without trust felt like existing rather than living. And I'd spent too many years building relationships on the foundation of honest communication to accept that honesty was now impossible. If staying alive meant accepting that everyone around me was lying for reasons they considered justifiable, then perhaps the cost of safety was higher than I was willing to pay. I need time to think, I said, moving toward the door with steps that felt steadier than my emotional state suggested they should be. Time is something we don't have, Dante replied. The Costa family knows their intelligence network has been exposed. They'll be moving to direct action within hours. The warning followed me from his study, but for the first time since collapsing on Chicago's rain-soaked streets, I felt more afraid of the people trying to protect me than of the enemies trying to harm me. When everyone around you is lying, trust becomes impossible. And without trust, even safety feels like another form of imprisonment. I spent 5 days in self-imposed exile from Dante's protection, returning to my apartment despite the obvious danger and his repeated warnings that isolation would make me vulnerable to the Costa family's increasingly desperate moves. The apartment felt different now. Not like home, but like a stage set where I'd been unknowingly performing for an audience of criminals who viewed my daily routines as intelligence-gathering opportunities. Every conversation with Emily over the past 3 years took on sinister new meaning as I replayed them in my mind. Casual questions about my work schedule that I'd interpreted as friendly interest had been data collection. Sympathetic inquiries about my emotional state during Mother's illness had been psychological profiling. Even our shared laughter and genuine moments of connection had been contaminated by the knowledge that everything was being reported to people who wanted to hurt someone I cared about. Sleep became elusive as paranoia replaced the familiar anxiety that had plagued me since Mother's death. Every sound in the building's old walls seemed suspicious. Every delivery person a potential threat. Every phone call from unknown numbers a prelude to violence. The panic attacks that had once incapacitated me with fear now felt almost manageable, compared to the constant hypervigilance that accompanied betrayal by everyone I'd trusted. On the 6th day, while organizing returns at the library, I discovered something that changed everything I thought I knew about my own history. Hidden between the pages of a medical journal someone had returned was a newspaper clipping from 3 years ago, yellowed with age, but still readable. The headline read, "Anonymous Benefactor Funds Cancer Treatment Program at Northwestern Memorial Hospital." The accompanying article described a private donation that had allowed the hospital to offer experimental treatments to patients whose insurance wouldn't cover innovative procedures. Among the recipients mentioned was my mother, though the article referred to her only as a librarian's mother, whose family had exhausted traditional treatment options. The photograph accompanying the article showed hospital administrators accepting a ceremonial check from representatives of what the caption identified as the Romano Foundation for Medical Research. In the background, partially obscured by shadows but unmistakably present, stood Dante Romano himself, younger than I knew him now, but wearing the same expression of controlled authority. My hands trembled as I studied the image, understanding finally clicking into place with devastating clarity. Dante hadn't helped my family from a distance as a stranger making charitable donations. He'd been personally involved in ensuring my mother received care, present at ceremonies I'd never been told about, actively engaged in managing her treatment in ways that went far beyond anonymous financial assistance. The revelation restructured everything I thought I understood about our relationship. His protection hadn't begun the night I collapsed in the rain. It had started years earlier, during my family's most desperate moment, when I'd been too overwhelmed with grief and medical crises to notice that miracles were being orchestrated by someone with both the resources and motivation to help. I called the number he'd given me for emergencies, my finger hovering over the contact for several minutes before finally pressing dial. He answered immediately, as always, his voice carrying concern that seemed more personal than professional. "Sophia, are you safe? I found something." My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "A newspaper article from when my mother was sick. You were there, Dante. At the hospital, personally involved in her treatment funding." The silence that followed stretched long enough that I wondered if the connection had been lost. When he finally spoke, his voice carried resignation rather than surprise. "Where are you?" "The library. Hiding in the rare books section because it feels like the only place in Chicago where no one's watching me. Stay there. I'm coming to get you. And this time we're going to discuss everything without limitations or strategic omissions. No more lies? No more lies," he promised. And something in his tone made me believe this was a commitment he would honor regardless of the cost. Dante arrived within 30 minutes, appearing between the library stacks with his usual silent efficiency, but looking more tired than I'd ever seen him. The controlled composure that characterized his public presence had been replaced by something rawer, more vulnerable, as if maintaining careful facades had finally become too exhausting to sustain. "Show me what you found," he said, settling into the chair across from my research table. I handed him the newspaper clipping, watching his face for reactions as he studied the image of himself at the hospital ceremony. His expression shifted through several emotions. Regret, sadness, something that might have been relief at finally having the truth exposed. 3 years, I said quietly. "You've been protecting me for 3 years, and you never told me. I've been honoring a promise I made to your mother," he corrected, his honesty gentle but complete. "During her final weeks, when the treatments weren't working despite everything medical science could offer, she asked me to ensure you'd be safe after she was gone." The words hit me like physical blows, restructuring my understanding of both my mother's death and Dante's involvement in my life. "You knew her personally?" "I knew her through the hospital's charity programs. She was grateful for the treatment funding, but worried about leaving you alone without family support." Dante's voice grew softer as he continued. "She made me promise that if anything ever threatened your safety, I would intervene personally, rather than through institutional channels. Why would she trust a stranger with that kind of responsibility? Because she was an excellent judge of character, who understood that sometimes the most dangerous people are also the most reliable when it comes to protecting innocent lives." Dante leaned forward, bringing his full attention to bear on my face. "And because she recognized that you would never accept direct help from someone like me, but you might accept protection if you believed it was coincidental rather than orchestrated." The systematic deception felt overwhelming, but this time it carried weight of care rather than manipulation. My mother, dying and desperate to ensure my future safety, had entrusted my protection to someone whose resources and moral code would make him capable of honoring such a promise, regardless of personal cost. "The night you found me in the rain," I said, pieces falling into place with crystalline clarity. "That wasn't coincidence either. I had people monitoring your routines to ensure your safety. When you deviated from normal patterns and walked alone through dangerous neighborhoods, security was dispatched to maintain discreet surveillance." Dante's admission came without apology, but with obvious regret for the deception it had required. "Finding you collapsed from a panic attack while being followed by potential threats activated protocols your mother and I had hoped would never be necessary. So everything between us has been built on lies. Everything between us has been built on a foundation of protection that required strategic omissions to be effective," Dante corrected. "But the emotions, the attraction, the growing connection, none of that was fabricated or manipulated." I studied his face for signs of deception, applying every psychological technique I'd learned for reading human behavior under stress. What I saw was exhaustion from maintaining necessary lies, mixed with genuine relief at finally being able to speak honestly about motivations that had driven years of covert protection. "Marco," I said suddenly, another piece clicking into place. "His sister. The Costa family threatened her to force his cooperation, but you've known about his divided loyalty for months. Marco came to me when the Costas first approached him. His sister's safety was never actually at risk because we moved her to protective custody the day after their initial contact." Dante's revelation continued dismantling my understanding of recent events. His apparent betrayal was performance designed to feed false information to the Costa family while we identified the full scope of their intelligence network, including Emily, who genuinely believed she was protecting her family by providing social information about someone the Costa family described as a potential witness to unspecified criminal activity. Dante's analysis was clinical, but not cruel. She never knew she was being used to gather intelligence about you specifically, or that her cooperation was part of a larger strategy to neutralize threats against someone I'd promised to protect. The revelation that Emily's betrayal had been manipulated by people even more calculating than I'd realized should have felt reassuring. But instead, it emphasized how completely my life had become a chess game, played by people with resources and motivations I couldn't fully comprehend. "What happens now?" I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded despite the emotional upheaval of having my entire reality restructured. "Now you have complete information and can make an informed choice," Dante replied. "Accept my continued protection with full knowledge of what it entails and why it began, or reject it and face the Costa family's escalating threats without assistance. Those aren't really choices. That's accept help or die. Sometimes the world only offers survival options rather than preferences," Dante said with brutal honesty. "But survival is still a choice. And it's one your mother wanted you to have the opportunity to make." I looked around the library's familiar interior, the stacks where I'd found refuge during every crisis, the research tables where I'd spent countless hours losing myself in other people's stories, the quiet corners where books had provided more reliable companionship than human relationships. This place represented everything I'd built my adult identity around, but it also represented limitations that might no longer be adequate for the person I was becoming. "If I choose your protection," I said carefully, "what does that mean for us personally? It means we find out what exists between us when it's not complicated by strategic deceptions or manufactured emergencies." Dante's smile held promise that felt more dangerous than any external threat I'd faced. "It means we discover whether what we feel for each other can survive complete honesty about who we are and what we're willing to do for each other." The offer was seductive and terrifying in equal measure. Accept Dante's protection and enter a world where violence was always one decision away, where power was maintained through methods that didn't require legal proceedings, where love itself might become a weapon used by enemies seeking leverage. But reject his help and face threats I couldn't counter alone, abandoning not just safety, but the possibility of discovering what we might build together. "The Costa family," I said, needing to understand the scope of immediate dangers before making longer-term commitments. "What exactly do they want from me now that their intelligence gathering has been exposed?" "Direct access to information about my operations, my security procedures, my personal vulnerabilities. Dante's assessment was matter of fact, but sobering. Or failing that, they want to use your continued existence as leverage to force concessions in business territories they're trying to acquire. Meaning? Meaning they'll keep you alive only as long as your suffering can be used to manipulate my decision-making, he said with controlled fury that made him seem more dangerous than I'd ever seen him. The moment they decide you're no longer useful for psychological warfare, you become a liability to be eliminated. The clinical description of my value as a hostage should have triggered another panic attack. But instead, I felt a strange clarity settle over my thoughts. The Costa family viewed me as expendable ammunition in a war I'd never chosen to join. But their mistake was assuming that being expendable meant being powerless. "I choose you," I said, the words emerging with conviction that surprised me. "I choose this dangerous life because it's the only real choice I have. And I choose to fight rather than hide." Dante's expression shifted through surprise, relief, and something that looked like pride. Fighting means accepting that you'll need to do things that contradict everything you thought you knew about yourself. "Then I guess I'll discover who I really am when everything familiar gets stripped away," I replied, feeling strength I didn't know I possessed flowing through my voice. "But I'd rather face that discovery with you than face certain death alone." As we prepared to leave the library together, I realized that my quiet life of books and solitary independence had been an illusion maintained by someone else's protection. But perhaps illusions were simply preparation for realities we weren't ready to accept. And now that truth was finally within reach, I could choose to embrace, rather than fear whatever came next. The abandoned warehouse in Chicago's industrial district felt like the end of the world, surrounded by rusted shipping containers and broken streetlights that created pools of darkness perfect for concealing violence. 3 weeks of careful planning had led to this moment. The Costa family's final desperate gambit to salvage their position by forcing a confrontation that would determine not just my fate, but the balance of power between Chicago's criminal organizations. I sat bound to a metal chair in the warehouse's center, my wrists secured with zip ties that cut into my skin whenever I moved. The concrete floor beneath me was stained with substances I preferred not to identify, while overhead fluorescent lights flickered with electrical problems that cast everything in unstable, stuttering illumination. Vincent Costa paced around me like a predator circling wounded prey, his expensive suit incongruous against the industrial decay surrounding us. He was older than I'd expected, maybe 60, with silver hair and the kind of cold authority that spoke of decades spent making life-and-death decisions without hesitation or regret. "Miss Winters," he said, his voice carrying cultured tones that belonged in boardrooms rather than warehouses scheduled for demolition. "I hope you understand that none of this is personal. You're simply the most effective pressure point available for influencing Mr. Romano's business decisions." 50 feet away, Emily and a young woman I didn't recognize, Marco's sister, I realized, were secured to similar chairs, both looking terrified, but unharmed. Their presence served as additional leverage, multiple hostages to complicate any rescue attempt, and ensure Dante's compliance with whatever terms Vincent intended to propose. "What do you want?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded despite the zip ties and the very real possibility that I might not survive the next hour. "Simple territorial concessions," Vincent replied, consulting an expensive watch that probably cost more than my annual salary. "Mr. Romano withdraws from the Port Authority contracts, ceases expansion into the Southside distribution networks, and transfers management of the Museum District Protection Services to our organization. In exchange for what? Your continued existence, and theirs." He gestured toward Emily and Marco's sister with casual indifference. Though I should mention that Mr. Romano's compliance isn't the only factor determining whether you leave here alive. Before I could ask what he meant, the warehouse's main entrance burst open with explosive force. Dante appeared in the doorway, flanked by Marco and 8 other men, all moving with the coordinated precision of military special forces. They spread through the space with practiced efficiency, taking positions behind shipping containers and machinery that provided cover while maintaining clear firing lines. "Vincent," Dante called across the warehouse, his voice carrying the same controlled authority I'd grown to associate with safety. "Let's discuss this like civilized businessmen." "Civilized businessmen don't kidnap innocent women to resolve commercial disputes," Vincent replied, positioning himself behind my chair where Dante's people couldn't get a clear shot without risking my safety. Civilized businessmen also don't threaten families to force cooperation from their subordinates, Dante countered, and I caught sight of him between the containers, looking more dangerous than I'd ever seen him. But we've both moved beyond civilization, haven't we? The standoff stretched for several heartbeats, tension coiling between the two groups like pressure in a sealed container. Around us, Chicago's industrial district hummed with late-night activity. Trucks on distant highways, trains moving through switching yards, the constant background noise of a city that never truly slept. Your terms are unacceptable, Dante continued, beginning to move closer with slow, deliberate steps. Counter-proposal. Release the women unharmed, and we settle this dispute through traditional means. Traditional means favor whoever has superior numbers and better strategic position, Vincent said with cold amusement. I have 3 hostages and home field advantage. You have more guns but no clear shots that don't risk civilian casualties. The tactical assessment was accurate but incomplete. Vincent had calculated firepower and positioning, but he'd failed to account for one crucial variable: the psychological stability of his hostages under extreme stress. During the past 3 weeks, Dante had insisted I learn techniques for managing panic attacks under pressure, turning my greatest vulnerability into a potential asset. Breathing exercises, grounding techniques, methods for maintaining clarity when adrenaline threatened to overwhelm rational thought. I'd assumed the training was precautionary, insurance against future anxiety episodes. Now I realized it had been preparation for exactly this scenario. Instead of letting fear consume my ability to think clearly, I forced myself to catalog every detail of our surroundings. Vincent's positioning behind my chair, the location of his backup personnel, the industrial equipment that might provide concealment or weapons, the timing of the flickering overhead lights that created brief moments of visual confusion. Emily, I called softly, drawing Vincent's attention back to me. Remember the breathing exercises we used to practice during exam week? The ones that helped with test anxiety? Emily's eyes widened with understanding, and I saw recognition dawn in her face. She began implementing the slow, controlled breathing pattern we'd developed during college, her visible panic gradually subsiding into focused calm. Marco's sister, I continued, not knowing her name, but needing her cooperation. Copy what Emily's doing. Breathe slowly. Count to 4 on each inhale. Hold for 4 counts. Exhale for 4 counts. The younger woman followed Emily's lead, and within minutes both hostages had transitioned from terrified civilians into people capable of coordinated action when the opportunity arose. Vincent noticed the change in atmosphere, his attention sharpening on what had been 3 panicked women, and was now becoming something more dangerous to his strategic position. Clever girl, but breathing exercises won't stop bullets or change the mathematics of this situation. No, I agreed. But they'll help us make better decisions when the mathematics change. As if summoned by my words, the warehouse's electrical system chose that moment to experience one of its periodic failures. The flickering lights died completely, plunging everything into darkness, broken only by emergency lighting that cast red shadows across concrete and steel. In the seconds of visual confusion that followed, everything happened at once. Emily threw herself sideways, taking her chair to the ground and rolling behind a shipping container. Marco's sister followed her lead, using techniques someone had clearly taught her for escaping restraints under pressure. Vincent's grip on my shoulder tightened as he tried to maintain control of his primary hostage. But I'd already begun implementing escape procedures Dante's people had drilled into me during weeks of preparation. The zip ties securing my wrists had been cut not with conventional tools, but with a ceramic blade hidden in the lining of my jacket. Invisible to metal detectors but sharp enough to slice through plastic restraints when applied correctly. As Vincent realized his hostages were escaping, his attention divided between maintaining personal safety and preventing the collapse of his strategic advantage. That moment of distraction was exactly what Dante's team had been waiting for. Marco appeared from the shadows like a specter, his silenced weapon eliminating Vincent's backup personnel with professional efficiency, while Dante closed the distance to where Vincent was struggling to maintain control of a hostage who was no longer willing to cooperate passively with her own captivity. "Let her go," Dante said, his voice carrying absolute authority, despite speaking barely above a whisper. "She's my insurance policy," Vincent replied, but his grip on my arm was weakening as he tried to track multiple threats in the unstable lighting. "Your insurance policy just became your liability." I twisted free of Vincent's grasp with techniques learned during 3 weeks of intensive self-defense training, putting distance between us while creating a clear line of sight for Dante's weapon. What followed was brutal and brief. Vincent Costa's long career of using violence to solve business disputes ended with the same swift efficiency he'd once applied to his own enemies. When the emergency lighting stabilized, he lay motionless on the concrete floor while Dante knelt beside me, checking for injuries with hands that trembled slightly despite his outward composure. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his professional assessment mixing with personal concern in ways that made his voice rough with emotion. "Scared but functional," I replied, surprised by how accurate the description felt. The terror was still there, but it existed alongside something new. Confidence in my ability to function under pressure that I'd never possessed before. Emily approached cautiously, looking shell-shocked but uninjured. "Sophia, I'm so sorry. For everything. For the spying. For the betrayal. For putting you in danger because of my family's problems. We'll discuss forgiveness later," I said, not unkindly, but with firmness that surprised all of us. "Right now we need to get out of here before police or federal agents arrive to investigate the gunshots." Marco's sister had already begun gathering evidence that might link the scene to Romano family operations, moving with efficiency that suggested this wasn't her first experience with post-violence cleanup procedures. Emily watched with fascination that bordered on horror, finally understanding the world she'd inadvertently become part of through her family's financial desperation. "What happens now?" Emily asked as Dante's people prepared our departure from the warehouse. "Now, the Costa family's Chicago operations cease to exist," Dante replied matter-of-factly. "Their territory gets redistributed among organizations capable of managing it without kidnapping civilians to resolve commercial disputes." "And us?" Dante looked at me with expression I couldn't quite interpret, something that might have been pride mixed with relief and anticipation. "That depends on what Sophia wants to do with the person she's discovered she can become under pressure." As we left the industrial district behind, driving through Chicago's late-night streets toward whatever future awaited us, I realized that the scared librarian who'd collapsed from a panic attack in the rain had died somewhere between accepting Dante's protection and fighting her way out of Vincent Costa's warehouse. The woman who remained was someone I was still getting to know, but someone who felt capable of building a life worth fighting for. The warehouse had been a test of everything I'd learned about myself over the past month. About trust and betrayal, about strength and vulnerability, about the difference between surviving and living. I'd passed that test not through violence, but through refusing to let fear consume my ability to think clearly when others needed me to remain functional. "Where are we going?" I asked as the city lights blurred past the sedan's bulletproof windows. "Home," Dante replied. And for the first time since this entire ordeal began, the word felt like a destination, rather than just a location, to discover what we can build together now that we both know exactly who we're choosing to become. 14 months later, I stood in the floor-to-ceiling windows of our renovated warehouse in River North, watching Chicago's morning rush hour unfold 40 stories below, while our daughter moved gently within me, responding to the city's vibrations with tiny kicks that never failed to make me smile. The view encompassed everything that had become important in my life. The library district where my old existence had ended, the industrial areas where new strength had been forged, the Lake Michigan shoreline that represented endless possibilities stretching toward horizons I was still learning to navigate. The transformation of my life over the past year had been more complete than I could have imagined when I'd first awakened in Dante's guest bedroom, terrified and disoriented, but unaware that safety could evolve into something far more profound than mere survival. The woman reflected in the window bore little resemblance to the librarian who'd collapsed from a panic attack in the rain, though books remained central to my identity in ways I'd never expected. "Mrs. Romano," came a voice from behind me, spoken with the respectful formality that had replaced the casual familiarity of my previous life. "The morning briefing is ready whenever you'd like to begin." I turned to find James, our personal assistant, holding a tablet containing updates on the various educational and cultural initiatives that had become my primary responsibility within Dante's expanding business empire. What had begun as a way to legitimize Romano family operations through charitable work had evolved into something more meaningful, genuine community investment that served both pragmatic and altruistic purposes. "How's the literacy program performing?" I asked, settling into the chair behind my desk, which had been positioned to offer commanding views of both the Chicago skyline and the private library that occupied nearly half of our top-floor office space. "Beyond projections," James replied, his enthusiasm genuine despite his professional demeanor. "The South Side Center's report reading comprehension improvements of 30% among participants, while the job placement program has achieved an 85% success rate. The numbers represented more than statistics. They reflected lives changed through access to education and opportunity, families lifted from poverty through skills training, communities strengthened through investment that prioritized people over profit margins. It was work that fulfilled me in ways that checking out library books never had, challenging and meaningful in equal measure." "And the museum partnership?" "The Romano Foundation's funding for the Chicago History Museum's Immigrant Experience exhibit has generated significant positive media attention. Mayor's office called it a model for private sector community engagement in yesterday's press conference." I smiled at the political praise, understanding its implications for Dante's broader business interests. Legitimate cultural investments provided excellent cover for less conventional operations while serving genuine public good. The balance between pragmatic necessity and authentic philanthropy had become one of the most satisfying aspects of my evolving role. Dante appeared in the office doorway with his usual silent efficiency, though his expression carried warmth rather than the controlled authority that characterized his business demeanor. Marriage had softened some of his sharper edges, while amplifying the protective instincts that had drawn me to him despite the danger he represented. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, approaching my chair with steps that seemed choreographed to avoid startling me, despite the fact that surprise attacks were no longer a realistic concern in our carefully secured environment. "Good morning, husband." The title still felt new on my tongue, weighted with implications I was still learning to navigate. "How did the Port Authority meeting go?" "Smoothly. The new contracts will increase legitimate shipping traffic by 40% while providing additional employment opportunities for neighborhoods that need economic development." Dante's explanation was delivered with the matter-of-fact tone he used for business updates, but I caught the satisfaction in his voice at achieving goals that served multiple purposes simultaneously. The integration of legal and illegal enterprises within Romano family operations had accelerated since Vincent Costa's elimination, with territory expansion focusing more on legitimate business opportunities than traditional criminal revenue streams. It was evolution rather than abandonment of family traditions, adaptation that preserved essential elements while reducing unnecessary risks. "Marco's sister wants to discuss expanding the youth mentorship program," I mentioned, consulting my notes from the previous day's meetings. "She thinks we could double enrollment if we add after-school components to the weekend workshops." "Approved. Whatever resources she needs." Dante's immediate agreement reflected both trust in my judgment and genuine commitment to programs that created alternatives to criminal recruitment for young people in economically disadvantaged areas. The Youth Mentorship Initiative had begun as strategic community relations, but evolved into something more personal after witnessing its impact on families struggling with the same poverty and limited opportunities that had defined my own childhood. These programs represented investment in futures that might otherwise be lost to violence or desperation, prevention rather than punishment, as an approach to community safety. "Dr. Martinez called about the anxiety research grant," I continued, referencing another project that combined personal experience with professional expertise. "The preliminary studies on panic attack management in high-stress environments are showing promising results. Your techniques? Modified for broader application. The breathing and grounding methods that helped me function during crisis situations are being adapted for first responders, military personnel, healthcare workers, anyone whose job requires maintaining clarity under extreme pressure. The transformation of my greatest vulnerability into a tool for helping others had been one of the most unexpected developments of the past year. My experience with panic attacks, once a source of shame and limitation, now contributed to research that might prevent others from experiencing the same helplessness I'd once felt when anxiety overwhelmed rational thought." A soft knock interrupted our morning planning session. Emily entered with a folder of documents, her appearance professional, but relaxed in ways that reflected her successful transition from reluctant informant to trusted employee. The Romano Foundation's educational programs had provided her with legitimate work that utilized her organizational skills while keeping her close enough for friendship to gradually heal the damage caused by her family's desperate choices. "The quarterly financial reports are ready for review," she said, placing the folder on my desk with movements that had gained confidence over the past year. "Revenue from legitimate operations is up 18%, while charitable expenditures are on track to meet the annual goals you set. The financial success of our legitimate businesses had exceeded even Dante's optimistic projections, proving that community investment could be profitable as well as beneficial. Museums, libraries, educational centers, job training programs, all generated both social good and positive cash flow while providing perfect cover for the more traditional aspects of Romano family operations. "How's your mother's recovery progressing?" I asked, genuine concern mixing with professional interest in Emily's personal situation. "Remarkably well. The physical therapy has helped her regain most of her mobility, and she's started volunteering at the senior center we helped establish in her neighborhood." Emily's gratitude was evident, but no longer desperate, replaced by the natural appreciation of someone whose family had been helped during crisis rather than exploited for intelligence purposes. The restoration of trust between Emily and me had been gradual, built through shared work on projects that mattered to both of us, rather than forced reconciliation. She understood that friendship with someone in my position came with certain limitations and responsibilities, while I'd learned that betrayal motivated by family desperation was qualitatively different from betrayal motivated by greed or malice. "Excellent. Make sure she knows the Foundation's medical coverage extends to preventive care as well as emergency treatment. The comprehensive healthcare program for employees and their families had been one of my first initiatives, inspired by memories of my own family's struggles with medical costs that insurance wouldn't cover. After Emily departed to handle the day's administrative tasks, Dante and I retreated to the private section of our office, a comfortable seating area surrounded by floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that housed both rare first editions and contemporary works on psychology, education, and community development. This space served as refuge when business pressures became overwhelming, literary sanctuary within the broader empire we were building together. "Any regrets?" Dante asked, settling beside me on the leather couch while his hand found its way to my growing belly, where our daughter moved with increasing frequency as her due date approached. "About which decision? Accepting your protection? Joining your family? Transforming my panic attacks into research opportunities? Or marrying someone whose enemies occasionally require permanent solutions?" My tone was light, but the question addressed serious territory we'd navigated carefully throughout our relationship. "Any of them. All of them." His honesty was gentle but complete. "I know this isn't the life you'd planned before you collapsed in that rain. The life I'd planned was built on illusions about safety and independence that were never realistic for someone like me." I leaned into his warmth, feeling our daughter respond to the sound of her father's voice, with movements that suggested she already recognized his presence. "This life is built on truth about what protection costs and what love requires. And you're comfortable with those costs and requirements?" "I'm comfortable with choosing them consciously, rather than having them imposed without my knowledge." The distinction had become crucial to my acceptance of everything Dante's protection entailed. "I understand what you do, and why it's necessary. I've seen what happens to people who refuse adequate security in worlds where violence is always an option." The memory of Vincent Costa's warehouse still occasionally triggered anxiety responses, but they were manageable now, controlled through techniques that transformed fear into focus rather than paralysis. The woman who'd escaped zip-tie restraints and coordinated hostage rescue operations was someone I'd needed to become, though I'd never imagined such capabilities lay dormant within my cautious librarian personality. "Dr. Martinez says our daughter will probably inherit my anxiety tendencies," I mentioned, referring to recent conversations about genetic predisposition and environmental factors, but also that children raised with healthy coping mechanisms tend to view anxiety as manageable, rather than overwhelming. "She'll never lack for protection or resources to handle whatever challenges she faces," Dante said with the absolute certainty that characterized his approach to family security. "But more importantly, She'll have parents who understand that strength comes from facing difficulties rather than hiding from them. The afternoon passed in comfortable routine, reviewing foundation reports, discussing security updates, planning expansion of educational programs that had proven successful beyond our initial expectations. The integration of legitimate and traditional family business had reached equilibrium, with each aspect supporting and concealing the other in ways that maximized both profit and community benefit. As evening approached, transforming Chicago's skyline into a canvas of gold and amber light, I found myself standing again at the windows that offered panoramic views of the city that had become truly home for the first time in my life. The library district where my old existence had ended looked different now. Not like limitation, but like preparation for possibilities I'd been too afraid to imagine. "Dinner's ready whenever you are," Dante said from the doorway, his voice carrying domestic warmth that belonged in suburban kitchens rather than the command centers of criminal organizations. "I'll be right there." I remained at the window for another moment, hand resting on my belly where our daughter moved in response to my voice. Considering the journey that had brought me from terrified collapse to confident partnership with someone whose protection had evolved into love that felt worth any price it required. The woman reflected in the glass wore expensive clothing that had been tailored to accommodate pregnancy, jewelry that marked her status within Chicago's complex social hierarchies, confidence that came from understanding exactly how much power she wielded and how to use it responsibly. She looked nothing like the librarian who'd fainted during a panic attack in the rain, but she carried the same love for books and learning that had always defined her core identity. "I'm not the same person I was when this started," I said aloud, though whether to Dante or to our unborn daughter or to my own reflection wasn't entirely clear. "Neither am I," Dante replied, his arms encircling me from behind with gentleness that contrasted sharply with the controlled violence he was capable of applying when family safety was threatened. "Some transformations are worth everything they cost." As we prepared to join Marco and his sister for dinner, family meals had become sacred time protected from business interruptions. I realized that accepting Dante's protection had taught me the difference between safety and security, between surviving and thriving, between independence and isolation. The choices I'd made had consequences that extended far beyond personal happiness into community impact and family legacy. Our daughter kicked again, stronger this time, as if responding to the contentment in her parents' voices or the promise of a future built on truth rather than illusion. She would grow up knowing exactly what her family did and why it was necessary, raised with resources and protection that would allow her to choose her own path while understanding the responsibilities that came with privilege. "She's going to be strong," Dante observed, feeling our daughter's movements through my skin. "She's going to be loved," I corrected, though strength and love weren't mutually exclusive in the world we were creating for her. "And she's going to understand that some things are worth fighting for." The Chicago skyline glittered beyond our windows, 8 million people pursuing dreams and ambitions that sometimes required protection from predators who viewed vulnerability as opportunity. Within that vast urban landscape, we'd carved out space for building something that mattered, a family, a legacy, a version of power that served others rather than simply accumulating resources for their own sake. As we headed toward dinner and conversation with people who'd become family through choice rather than blood, I understood finally that panic attacks in the rain sometimes led to destinations we never could have reached through careful planning. Some journeys began with collapse and ended with transformation that made the terror of falling worth every moment of uncertainty about where we might land.